2 weeks ago, I posted an episode of Nihon no Konyohen Shokai, where I talked about some Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh games I've gotten over the past year or so. And last week, we talked about some other Yu-Gi-Oh games that I've just been buying up and collecting. Talked about like the Xbox game, the only Xbox game, the two Wii games. I finished up the DS games, for example. So yeah, very, very exciting. And today we're going to talk about a system that is near and dear to my heart. The day you're watching this happens to be my birthday, so even better that we're going to be talking about a system I'm very, very fond of, for a series that I'm very, very fond of. So this is going to be super exciting. I even got my green Neat Dude hat on, so that's how exciting this is. So at some point in the past, I have shown off all of these games in like months in review, different months. So just to very briefly go over those few games, I've shown off Yu-Gi-Oh! Worldwide Edition, Stairway to the Destined Duel. This game is complete in box with its original promos, as is the next few games that I'm about to show. All Yu-Gi-Oh! Games came with promo cards here in North America, some in Japan, but almost all of them in North America got promo cards. And yeah, these first four I've shown off all had their promo cards included, including World Championship Tournament 2004. We talked a little bit about the World Championship Tournament games in the last episode, and maybe we're going to talk about them again today. Also, Destiny Board Traveler, just a strange spin-off to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. We talked about the Japanese version of the game very briefly 2 weeks ago. And then the last one, of course, a game I'm grew up with, super duper fond of. It might have been like the last game I showed off in my like childhood games video, Eternal Duelist Soul. I can play this game over and over again and never get bored. As I've been researching for these games, I was like so tempted to pick up Eternal Duelist Soul, but I'm like, I got other things to do. But yeah, I could play this game all day long. So that was 4 complete in box Yu-Gi-Oh games with their promos. So naturally, what do you do after getting the first 4? Not first 4, just 4 of them complete in box with their promos. Well, you get the last 8 of them. So according to price charting, there are 15 Yu-Gi-Oh games that were released on Game Boy Advance. One of them is a GBA video that I had growing up. I don't have it now. I'll get it at some point, but that wouldn't have had promos. It was just a GBA video, so I'll get that back at some point. 2 of them are just really weird variants to games that I have here that I'll probably never even come across. I can't even find them on like eBay. There's like one on eBay that's sealed and it's like $400. I'm not going to do that. But the remaining 8 games, so 15 games minus the 4 I just showed, minus the 3 I just talked about, leaves 8. I now have all 8 of those games complete in box with their promos. So again, for my birthday, we're just going to talk about some Yu-Gi-Oh! Game Boy Advance games, because that was like the crux of my childhood, even though I never played any of these games growing up. So that's super exciting to me. Let's get right into it. Like I said, all these games have promos, but also, just to throw it out there, all these games are developed and published by Konami, kind of like most of the last 2 episodes. I'm pretty sure almost every game in the last 2 episodes, minus like Capsule Monster Coliseum from the Japanese episode, was not developed by Konami, but all these games here were developed and published by Konami. So we'll get that out of the way. Normally I like to talk about that, but Konami is also responsible for the card game, so makes a lot of sense. So, except for this very first game, like I said, all of them have promos. This first game didn't come with promos, so that's fine. It's a good place to start. This would be Dungeon Dice Monsters, which is more a board game that was initially released in Japan in March 2001, but it didn't come to North America until almost 2 full years later in February 2003. Now, that's a trope I want you to keep in mind as we go through the video. This game took almost 2 full years to come out, and as you see as we go over time, the release dates between games actually starts to shrink, which is a really good thing. So, Dungeon Dice Monsters is found in both the anime and the manga, and I remember seeing it in the anime when I was watching it growing up. Specifically, Dungeon Dice Monsters is Duke Devlin's game that he created in the anime, or at least as I remember it in the anime, in the Battle City arc, which you're also going to see a lot of these games are Battle City games, which is just kind of strange, but that's also like, the season that was out when most of these games were created. So in the anime, Yugi meets Duke Devlin. I think Duke Devlin flirts with Taya, wants to go on a date with Taya, but then Duke challenges Yugi to a game of Dungeon Dice Monsters since Yugi's like the king of games. And Yugi initially struggles because, he's like never played Dungeon Dice Monsters before. It's a brand new game to him. But in the very first time Yugi plays, he manages to beat Duke Devlin at his own game, which is, kind of weird, kind of, what's that, plot armor, I think, kind of. But then Duke ends up signing a contract to put the game into real life, or to make the game a reality in the anime, and presumably the manga as well. And it's a rare time that a spin-off game in the anime/manga became a real-life game. For example, Dungeon Dice Monsters ended up being a board game and actually had expansions that you could buy packs for. I actually remember getting that. Basically a weird connection. It was like my birthday or Christmas one year. Somebody that knew my dad got me, or it might have even been my dad that got it for me, but they saw Yu-Gi-Oh! In the store and was like, Max likes Yu-Gi-Oh! And got it for me. This is like, almost 20 years ago. So, I had a physical Dungeon Dice Monsters starter set. I don't have it anymore. It's long gone. Maybe I should get it. I think it was like $75 on eBay brand new. So maybe I'll get that. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. It's a rare time that one of the spin-off games in the series becomes a real-life physical game. Not only a video game, but also like an actual game. Capsule Monster Coliseum was pretty close when we talked about it in the Japanese episode, but that game did that game did get a physical release along with its video game release. So kind of cool, right? Duelist of the Roses wasn't really a thing in the anime, but Capsule Monster Coliseum was, Dungeon Dice Monsters was, so it was a good way for Konami to capitalize on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Craze when it was by putting out anything and everything that could have been sold at the time. So, and I'm going to talk about it a couple times over the course of this episode, but my frame of reference when I'm talking about these games and like how they would have been received is, if I got this game when I was growing up, how would I perceive Yu-Gi-Oh? Would it match what I expected from Yu-Gi-Oh? And Dungeon Dice Monsters would be a game that probably would have soured a couple people playing Yu-Gi-Oh. Kind of talked about that again with like Capsule Monster Coliseum a long time ago, or not, 2 weeks ago, where if Capsule Monster Coliseum was your first Yu-Gi-Oh video game, it kind of skewed the way you looked at the series because that's not at all how the game was played. And same thing with Dungeon Dice Monsters. Not that I ever learned to play the actual Dungeon Dice Monsters game, but if this was somebody's first Yu-Gi-Oh game, they'd be very confused because it doesn't really match the anime past the like episode or like few episodes that Duke Devlin is a part of in the Dungeon Dice Monster like mini arc. I don't know. So kind of weird. A very early, strange early release for Yu-Gi-Oh! We're going to go in timeline order from earliest release to latest release, not including the 4 I've already shown. But Dungeon Dice Monsters. Next up is a game that's a lot more accurate, but not entirely accurate to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game, and that would be The Sacred Cards. So this game is definitely more of a dueling game than Dungeon Dice Monsters. This game was initially released in Japan in July of 2002 and didn't come to North America until a year and about 4 months later. So we went from almost 2 years to a year and 4 months. Finally released here in North America in November 2003. So, but I believe that this is the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Game Boy Advance game to be more like an RPG than strictly a dueling game. So, like, for example, Dungeon Dice Monsters is not a dueling game. But it's also not an RPG. Eternal Duel of Soul is literally just choose people from a list that you'll want to duel. But I believe The Sacred Cards was the first game to be released that was more an RPG along with dueling elements, but an RPG first. So I believe The Sacred Cards was the first one to do that, but not the last game to do that. We'll talk more about that as we go. So the story to The Sacred Cards is almost identical to the Battle City arc. So again, this Battle City trope that we're going to talk about in a lot of these games is in a lot of them, literally. But it's the first mainline Yu-Gi-Oh! Game Boy Advance game. Oh, wait, hold on. I got my notes wrong. Oh, yeah, okay, sorry. Talking about, like, the accuracy to the card game. And this was not, right? Like I said, it's an RPG. So it's the first game that forces you to walk around and talk to people and just to progress the story. But it's weird because even though Eternal Duelist Soul had come out before this game, and Eternal Duelist Soul was very accurate to the card game, the Sacred Cards kind of just throws that out. So, I'm not like super fluent in like game development, but like, hear me out. The engine that is used in Eternal Duelist Soul for dueling is very polished. It's very good, like very minor glitches, but it's very accurate to the card game. And that actually gets thrown out here. Beyond just the RPG part, not only do the cards in the Sacred Cards, not only are not all of them like TCG and OCG cards, some of them are also just like anime cards or cards that never actually saw a physical release. So you had cards that didn't really exist in the way they were supposed to. But beyond that, there was game mechanics that completely broke the game. So not only were there cards that didn't really exist, some cards were altered to be something they weren't. So for example, like some effect monsters were not effect monsters, they were normal monsters, I guess just because they couldn't code the effect into the game, I don't know. But also just all these alterations to the real game that, to me, it's very confusing because Eternal Duelist Soul, again, that came out before this, was very accurate to like the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, and they chose to not do that in the Sacred Cards. And it's also not the last time they're gonna do that in the games I'm gonna show today. So that's kind of weird to me. Okay, and sorry, I'm like trying to remember my notes. I should have read them over before I started the video. But if anything is a benefit to this game, is even though the dueling isn't necessarily accurate to the real game, it is a lot closer to what you would expect from a Yu-Gi-Oh story than like something like Dungeon Dice Monsters or something like Capsule Monster Coliseum. So, Dungeon Dice Monsters probably would skew the way you view Yu-Gi-Oh when you're a kid. But if you got the Sacred Cards, even if the dueling was off, even if the mechanics were a little off, at the very least, it's the Yu-Gi-Oh story, and you do play the game just in a strange way. Maybe it doesn't necessarily translate to how you would play the TCG, but at least you're dueling. Dungeon Dice Monsters, you're not dueling. But definitely a way more accurate representation to what Yu-Gi-Oh is if your parents just picked this up off a shelf and gave it to you for your birthday or something. So the Sacred Cards. Sorry, that was a little jumbled. I maybe should have gone over my notes before I did this, but the Sacred Cards. And then the follow-up to the Sacred Cards would be Reshef of Destruction. So this is another dueling RPG that ends up being the direct sequel to the Sacred Cards. This game was released in Japan in March 2003, and it didn't come to North America until a year and three months later in June 2004. So again, we went from almost 2 years, a year and 4 months, to a year and 3 months. So, like I said, it's a sequel to the Sacred Cards. However, the Sacred Cards is almost exactly like the Battle City arc in the anime, whereas even though this is a sequel, it doesn't align with the post-Battle City events of the anime. So it's kind of like an alternate universe of what happens after Battle City. But it's very interesting. So this game is super weird and super fleshed out, and you end up literally all over the world in this game. Just to name it a few places that you go to Italy, you go to China, and you also go to Canada, amongst some other places like the Galapagos Islands. So that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure about the original anime in Japan, but I know that here in North America, the dub sort of didn't really talk about real-world locations. You were just kind of in the realm of Yu-Gi-Oh! No pun intended using realm for Shadow Realm, but like in North America, we didn't get an anime that talked about like, oh, we're in Japan, oh, we're going to Italy, oh, we're like this thing is happening in Canada. It's all just kind of in a vacuum. Whereas this game like really references and hammers home like traveling around the world to play Yu-Gi-Oh! So I think that is very interesting that they would reference that. I'm guessing maybe in like the original anime they do talk about real world locations that for some reason just didn't happen in North America. But I did find that interesting enough to mention because it's the only game that does that, only game that mentions real world locations. Although now that I'm thinking about that, it's not even in my notes, but Duelist of the Roses kind of is like that too, even though it's like kind of separate. But not the point, I digress. So this game also has similar, strange, non-card game mechanics and alterations. And this game is actually a lot more difficult than the Sacred Cards. So Sacred Cards and Race Chef of Destruction kind of go hand in hand, but this game is like way more difficult. Just to name of the few things that changed, you have deck costs, like your deck can't be of a certain power to battle other people. So deck costs for certain cards went up, and the restrictions to some cards the restrictions became tougher. So it's weird because it became a lot harder to build a deck. And while I would normally say the added difficulty was good, kind of, again, going in this frame of reference as to like how a kid would respond to this, unless this was your very first Yu-Gi-Oh game and you were kind of just going along with what was happening, this game was probably really difficult. At least from what I could tell, it was very, very difficult. So I don't know if this would have been the best Yu-Gi-Oh game. Of course, kids just play Yu-Gi-Oh games, but specifically with the deck cost thing, that deck cost system is present in Duelist of the Roses, and I remember playing Duelist of the Roses growing up and never being able to progress past a certain point because I didn't understand what was wrong with my deck and why I couldn't use it from the frame of like, oh, my deck is too powerful to battle this person, so I'm not allowed to battle them. So that kind of idea is present here, and I couldn't figure it out as a kid, so I'm sure there are plenty of other children that couldn't figure it out as well. So that's a thing here. So like, you know, added difficulty is good, but maybe not so much in the main story, like, you know, early on, but you know, that's kind of just what happens. I've also never heard of somebody that actually played this game, so yeah, that's another thing too. But the one positive addition from the Sacred Cards is that there is a presence of a post-game in this game, as opposed to no post-game in the Sacred Cards. You just keep dueling in the Sacred Cards. But in Race Chef of Destruction, there is a post-game where you get to battle against super prominent anime characters. You know, your people like Pegasus, Seto Kaiba, Dark Joey, not even Joey Wheeler, like Dark Joey that is possessed by Merrick. Also Yami Bakura, Yami Yugi, Yami Merrick, and among some other characters that are familiar to different parts of the anime. But yeah, you get to play them, and they're like really freaking difficult to beat. I'm pretty sure this was the game that like normally you start a duel at 8,000 life points. Like most Yu-Gi-Oh games start at 8,000 life points, and some of these characters that you'd have to battle, they would start at like 60,000 life points, and you had to beat them with that much damage. So very weird, very strange. Yeah, Sacred Cards and Race Chef of Destruction kind of go hand in hand. We might talk about why they go hand in hand later, but yeah, of all the games here, this is probably one that I definitely would not have played growing up, or definitely would not have understood. So, Race Chef of Destruction. Next up is a continuation to the World Championships line. So we talked about World Championships in the last episode, and we're going to talk about the second entry in the World Champs series, and that would be 7 Trials to Glory World Championships 2005. So the first game in the World Champs series was 2004, one I showed off just in the preface of the video, and this is the second game in that series. So it's a dueling game, initially released in Japan in December 2004, and came to America in February 2005, so that was a year and 2 months later. So again, just keeping track of this progression, almost 2 years, year and 4 months, year and 3 months, and now year and 2 months. So we're getting better. It's a follow-up to World Champs 2004, and it isn't so much an RPG like the last two games as it is just a duel different daily characters, gain points, register for tournaments, and it's entirely dueling-based, entirely tournament-based, entirely reward-based for doing certain things. So for that reason, I think it's probably a little bit better than the RPGs the last two were, especially better than Race Chef of Destruction, because it's apparently so difficult, at least from what my small brain can tell. But there is still a story mode like those games, as opposed to a campaign mode. The campaign mode is kind of what I was talking about with like Eternal Duelist Soul, and also World Champs 2004, where you just pick duelists from a list. But the story mode is also still very loosely based around the Battle City arc, and the game is completely centered around gaining duelist points to acquire new cards and register for tournaments. So things you could do, like if you beat an opponent, or if you reduce their life points in certain ways, or you beat them in a certain amount of turns, you gain points for that, and you use those points to acquire cards. You use those points to register for tournaments. So it's kind of interesting for that. It's definitely more pick up and play than the previous two games, just because of their RPG elements, at least in my opinion. But from what I gathered, at least the duels are authentic, so we finally get back to, Eternal Duel of Soul, where at least the mechanics make sense again. That's good. And another big thing that I realized, like, while I was writing, is that also, while I don't necessarily love a point system, because if a kid doesn't have any more points, they probably get totally lost. But if anything, it would teach them, like, money management. Like, oh, I don't have enough points to go do this. And if you played 7 Trials to Glory enough, you probably would have a better understanding of how to spend your money and how to spend your time. So that's definitely a plus to the game, even though I definitely would not have thought that normally. But yeah, that's one thing that I definitely, if I was to go back and play any of these games now, up to this point, I definitely would play 7 Trials to Glory first, because the last 2 games don't sound appealing to me, Sacred Cards and Rechef of Destruction. So there's 7 Trials to Glory. Also interesting, I said all these games have promo cards, and this copy I was able to get with promo cards right away, as opposed to needing to buy them separately. And the seller actually had the promo cards still sealed in their original packaging, along with the rest of the game. This copy is in, like, beautiful condition. So just something I wanted to mention. But 7 Trials to Glory. Next up, we finally move out of the Battle City arc and into the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. So, after the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Cast was sort of, not put to rest, that sounds horrible, but, like, after that story was put to rest, no more Yugi, no more Joey, no more Taya, we finally moved to Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, which I believe kind of happens in tandem with the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Arcs, but they don't really cross over. I believe there's a movie where they actually do cross over. I'm sure there's some episodes where they do cross over, but what I'm trying to gather here is that I did not watch the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. I remember it coming out. I was probably not a big Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan when it did come out, so, like, I have some memories of the cards, some memories of what was going on then, but if it wasn't original Yu-Gi-Oh! And it wasn't, like, Yugi and Joey, I was probably a little brain dead to it. So we do move into the GX. We finally out of the Battle City arc. Hallelujah. But yeah, now we're going to move into the GX era. So we have Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Duel Academy, a dueling game initially released in Japan in October 2005. And we finally make a humongous leap into release dates. So again, almost 2 months for Dungeon Dice Monsters, a year and 4 months for the Sacred Cards, a year and 3 months for Rechef of Destruction, a year and 2 months for 7 Trials to Glory, and we drop all the way down to a 3-month, just 3 and almost an entire year subtracted, a 3-month delay from Japan's release to North America's release. I don't know why I started to put that down. I'm not done yet. And it was released here in January 2006. So I'm trying to think of, like, where I was January 2006. I was probably starting to get out of Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like this is probably like my Fire Red era for Pokemon, if I'm being super honest. So yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was kind of going on the back burner. I kind of jumped between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon growing up, but here we are, nonetheless. It's definitely an interesting hybrid of the previous 3 games we've talked about. It's definitely more story-based, like the Sacred Cards and Rechef, but it has a dueling point system, like 7 Trials to Glory, so even if the story mode part isn't super crazy fleshed out, at least it takes, like, some of the good elements to the games to make something a little bit, not different, but a little more balanced between the 2 types, perhaps, even though this isn't a World Champs game. So that's also interesting, just something to mention. But it's the first GX game on any system at all. So we got Yu-Gi-Oh! Original Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, we got Yu-Gi-Oh! GX games, we got Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D games. We're still getting Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, even though we're completely out of that era, those arcs. But it's the first GX game on any system at all. And there's quite a few. Definitely a few on DS, like we talked about last week. There's one more we're going to talk about in this episode. But yeah, the first GX game is also definitely a very interesting tidbit about this game. There's a new effect activation system that absolutely slaughters previous systems. So hear me out. If you've never played any of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, I get it. This isn't going to make a lot of sense. But here's one gripe I have with Eternal Duel of Soul. There are some cards whose effects can be activated at almost any trigger. So your opponent plays a monster, your opponent attacks, your opponent discards a card. Like, there are some cards whose effect can be triggered at anything that happens. So if you have a certain card placed on the field, like a trap face down, it is entirely possible that you are clicking through somebody's entire turn just to say, no, I don't want to activate right now. And it drives me ballistic sometimes because the duels can go really long. And it's even gotten to the point where as I play Eternal Duel of Soul more, I just like don't add those cards to my deck even though they're useful. So that's kind of funny to begin with, but also this game completely overhauls that because when you add a card to your deck, you have the option to select and deselect the different times you want to be able to activate that card so that you're not trying to do it in the middle of a duel. You're not constantly clicking, no, I don't want to trigger this. So of course that could bite you in the butt if you have a certain trigger deselected where you in some cases might actually want to trigger it, but I'm sure that saved a lot of time, to be completely honest with you. So that's a good thing. It's an overall good thing. But there isn't really much else to say here. The gameplay is super polished, and the short conversion time kind of showed that Konami finally started to figure out how to develop these games and get them down to a science. So yeah, not really a whole lot here. It's a GX game. Not super familiar with GX to begin with, so any story that there is, I'm just not familiar with it. But yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Duel Academy. Okay, we are getting close to the end. We got 3 more to talk about, but the last one is going to be like the last main release we talk about, and that would be Yu-Gi-Oh! Ultimate Masters World Championships 2006. So 2004, 2005, 2006, and 2007, like we saw last week. Or sorry, I showed 2007 off in the Retro GameCon video. So 2007 was on the DS, so we got 3 of them on GBA. So this is a dueling game initially released in Japan in February 2006. And what's the word I'm looking for? The progression of time between games finally got down to a really, really excellent time. It went down to a whole 3 weeks, where the Japanese version was released in February 2006, and we got the game only 3 weeks later in March 2006. So that's fantastic. I'm drawing a blank as to how long the release times were for the DS games, but I'm kind of assuming that they were less. I don't know why I can't remember that right now, but that's okay. It's the last main Yu-Gi-Oh! Release on Game Boy Advance, besides 2 more things we're going to talk about, and like I said, the last World Champs on GBA, but it's by far, easily, the most polished Yu-Gi-Oh! Game on the Game Boy Advance. So let's name some of the things here. So for one, it has over 2,000 cards that were released. It's somehow not all of the cards that were released in the card game at the time, but has over 2,000 cards that are strictly from the card game. So no baloney anime cards, no baloney GX cards, no baloney effect monsters becoming normal monsters. It is as true to the actual card game as humanly possible. So at the time. But yeah, going to like that frame of, was this a good game for a kid to play? Yeah, this 100% was. So it had 2,000 cards, but that wasn't even actually all of them. There were some cards that were left out, just to name a few. But over 2,000 cards is fantastic, considering that like the games before had like 1,000 cards in them, and this one had 2,000 cards. So that's crazy. I haven't talked about it in previous episodes, but also for the previous games. But pretty much every Yu-Gi-Oh! Game has a password system. On the actual TCG cards, all of them have an 8-digit code that you could put into the games. It's kind of like an ID for the card, but you could put it into the games and unlock the card in your games. So pretty much all those games have a password system. Some of them you might need to pay duelist points for, but in all those cases, you were only ever able to get one of them. So even if you were to pay tons of duelist points to unlock a card, you can only unlock one of them. Whereas this changes it up quite a bit, where not only are you able to input those passwords as many times as you want, but it's like the cards are scaled as to how many duelist points you have to pay. So if you're unlocking like a really, really good card into the game, you got to pay a lot of duelist points for it. Whereas if you're unlocking something a lot less popular, you didn't have to pay as much. So kind of going back to the money management system, but it's a really good place for it because it's not a required part of the game. So, if you were a kid, you could just try and unlock like 100 copies of the most expensive card, but you had to pay for that. So not required, as opposed to like a lot of the story stuff that it would be needed for. So I like that as a concept. More campaign and dueling based, which if you haven't gathered, I like a lot more. The campaign mode that like Eternal Duel of Soul mostly started is the best. Then it doesn't really have any story mode. It's pretty much all dueling, which is fantastic. But there's some modes which are unique to this game, at least at the time, where you can not only build separate decks. So one big difference from Eternal Duel of Soul is that you can only have one deck made at a time, and as time went on, you were able to save more decks at once, so you didn't need to continuously keep changing your deck if you wanted to just use different decks. But it finally got up to the point that you could store like 20 decks in this game. So not only are you battling other duelists, you can battle against decks you've made, and the AI figures out your deck for you, which is really, really cool. And not only are you playing against other decks you've made, you can also play against the deck you are currently using. So you can play test, different decks you've created, but also go right up against what you would see, if you were playing yourself, which is really, really cool. The only minus I could possibly say about this game as a game is that we have taken away the anime characters to duel against, and you are now battling against monsters whose deck is based around that monster. So, for example, you might battle Kuribo, and it's a deck based around Kuribo, kind of like the start of using... I shouldn't say that. I was going to say archetypes, but archetypes have been in like all these games. So, but themed around those monsters and built around those monsters, which is really, really cool, very interesting. But yeah, like the not having the anime characters in it might have been a minus for some kids way back when. So that could be a minus, but honestly, that it seems like the dueling is so good that it probably doesn't hurt you all that much. So really, really fantastic way to kind of sunset the games for Yu-Gi-Oh! And GBA. But they're actually not the last two releases on Game Boy Advance, because we got some compilations. Only two. These are not going to take nearly as long to go over, so don't worry. But we got 2 double packs in North America. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Double Pack 1 was released in August 2006. In February 2006. And it was only released in America and Europe, so Japan was like, we don't need compilations. And honestly, they probably didn't, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Was definitely way more popular for way longer in Japan than it was here, so I'm sure those kids actually held on to their games. But it was only released in America and Europe. It contained the Sacred Cards and Reshef of Destruction, so kind of talking about how they were very interconnected as very heavy RPGs and sequels of each other. Perfect thing to put on one cartridge. It literally just says Yu-Gi-Oh! Double Pack 2 on the cartridge. Yu-Gi-Oh! Double Pack on the cartridge, and would say Yu-Gi-Oh! Double Pack 2 on the cartridge. So that's kind of cool. But one weird thing about this release is these releases also had promo cards, so you would think, oh, it's gonna come with both sets of promo cards for Sacred Cards and Reshef of Destruction. Or it comes with brand new ones. And no, Yu-Gi-Oh! Double Pack is super weird. It comes with Reshef of Destruction promos, but it originally had 3 promos, and we only get 2 of them here. And not only do we only get 2 of them, we get 2 versions that are different. So the original ones would have been secret rare promos, which if you know Yu-Gi-Oh, you know what a secret rare looks like. Whereas these are super rares, which are slightly lower among the like rarity list. A lot less cool looking, that's for sure. But also just kind of weird that, had different promos, even though it's the same. I don't know. It's very complicated. But yeah, kind of weird. Double Pack 1. And then last but not least for this video is Double Pack 2. This one was released in August 2006. But this time it was only released in North America, not even in Europe. And this one contained Destiny Board Traveler and Dungeon Dice Monsters. And this one had Destiny Board Traveler's promos because, as you remember from the beginning of the video, Dungeon Dice Monster didn't have any promos. So at least this time you got all 3 in their original form. Still very strange, but definitely this was a good pack to put together. I mean, the last one is good too, right? They're sequels. But these 2 games were released super early on in Game Boy Advance Yu-Gi-Oh! Games. So it was a good way to not only take the 2 spin-offs that were released on the system, but put them into one cartridge at the end of releasing Game Boy Advance games for Yu-Gi-Oh! So that's also pretty interesting. And that's the end of Game Boy Advance games on Yu-Gi-Oh! So now we have all 12. Like I said, there's 3 more. One of them I'll get at some point, but it isn't it isn't the same type. It's just a GBA video cart. And the other 2 are just variants that I'm probably never going to come across in real life. So that's fine if I don't get them. Overall, now that we have done stuff in the Retro Game Con video, we've talked about stuff in October in review. Nihon no Konyo Henshokai had Japanese games, so that doesn't count. But also the games we talked about last week. In total, all of this, I am somehow still missing Yu-Gi-Oh! Games. So here's just a list of the ones that I'm missing. There were 4 PSP games. Tag Force, which we talked about in the first episode of this, Nihon no Konyo Henshokai, where I got Tag Force 4 in Japanese. There's 4 here in North America, but I'd like to get the full set of 6 in Japan. There's 3 Greatest Hits variants. Dawn of Destiny has a Greatest Hits variant. Duelist of the Roses has a variant I don't have. And drawing a blank as to what the other one is. But False Bound Kingdom on GameCube also had a player's choice. So at some point I'll get those variants if I'm really feeling it. But I might not. It ain't going to kill me. There's a PS2 game that's technically part of the Tag Force series. It's in the GX arc. I definitely want to get that one at some point, but it's pretty expensive. So we'll come back to that one later on. There's a trio of PC games that I don't have. I showed off one of them last week, but that one is completely separate. The other 3, there's a trio of them, and I'm just assuming they're all the same games, but one is like the Yugi edition, one is the Kaiba edition, one's the Joey edition. So I don't know. I'll get that one at some point, but of course those are all not kind of expensive, but the 3 of them would be a little expensive altogether. And of course, at some point I'll collect all the Japanese games too, but one thing at a time. Going forward, not only those, but also in February, at the end of February, we're getting the Early Days collection for Yu-Gi-Oh! So at the time of recording, they've only announced like 6 games, 6 Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games that are coming to the Early Days collection. So Konami has this weird thing where they're like only re-releasing games. Like all the Castlevania games are just being re-released instead of getting new Castlevania games. And they're kind of going along with Yu-Gi-Oh! But at the very least, I really like Yu-Gi-Oh! So it's okay. I'm definitely going to get that. If there's like some limited edition, I'm going hard on that. But yeah, I don't know. So that's just what's coming in the future for Yu-Gi-Oh! At least from a modern perspective. So with that said, before I close out, I just want to give a huge thank you to Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki and GameFAQs for a ton of this information. I would not be able to talk about these games nearly as long as I did without especially the Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki and GameFAQs to cross-reference release dates. But yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki, not that anybody here is watching, not that anybody here is a contributor there, but without you, I definitely would not have been able to make this video and the previous 2 videos. So thank you so much for watching this episode of me talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! Games for the 3rd time in a row. But I hope I taught you something. If there's anything I missed, please let me know. I would love to continue learning about these games as much as I have hopefully taught you something. And with all that said, hold on here. Bye.